hopeless eyes of those who are starving as a result of the lunatic policies of the governments of the world? And will you have the love in your hearts to say enough is enough? Thank you.
Lord Monckton, on behalf of those people who are here, and on behalf of hundreds of thousands whom I'm sure would like to be here, I do thank you. I should let you know it's a measure of the progress that you've made, though, in prosecuting this case, that there are people in this room tonight who've come very, very long distances to be here, which I met many of them when they're outside, and I think we're grateful for that show of support, and it does indicate that people are prepared to make an effort and a sacrifice in order to see that this nonsense doesn't prevail. I'll take some questions in a moment, and while you're thinking about them, I'll just ask you to perhaps sum up a couple of points which I know from the correspondence and the calls I get concern people. Firstly, what therefore is the current status, do you think, of the IPCC? And secondly, that Copenhagen argument that the so-called rich countries, and I might add America with $1 trillion of debt was categorised as one of them, are going to provide $30 billion by 2020, and we're part of all of this ostensibly, in cash, to those countries who will be encouraged to mitigate the perceived problems that exist. What's the status of all of that? And finally, to put it all into one, what is the motivation, do you think, of people who continue to prosecute untruths?
Right, very good questions, those. And let's just talk briefly then about the IPCC. This intergovernmental panel, note it's not a scientific panel, it's an intergovernmental panel. This was established by a Canadian bureaucrat called Sir Maurice Strong. 25 years ago, he said that he wanted it to transmogrify into a world government, and they thought they could do it at Copenhagen. But thanks to you, they couldn't. And now it is all downhill for the UN's climate panel. Its chairman and its former chairman facing indictment, prosecution, and jail for false accounting and scientific fraud. And wouldn't it be nice if the UN went the same way? Some of us might. And you see, the great thing about this is that when you say you want to see the back of the UN, we are not talking of a xenophobic nation. Nobody could accuse a nation as generous as Australia of xenophobia in any sense. And yet you don't want the new UN. Same reason I don't. Because it's corrupt, bent, expensive, and useless. Same goes for the IPCC. So your next question was, just remind me.
$30 billion.
That's right, all this money. Are we going to pay this money? Well, I tell you, Britain isn't, because we haven't got it. Australia isn't, because you haven't got it. And Obama and Gore aren't, because they ain't got it either. So all of this is what we in the SAS used to call micturation and ventilation when the officers were listening. It's not going to happen, any of it. After all, with 174 of 194 nations already in default simply on a requirement to write to the Secretariat saying, hello, Secretariat, this is how much we're going to cut our carbon emissions in the next 10 years, the fact is the entire process now looks as though it has collapsed. However, it is never sensible to let our guard down.
Yeah,
the trouble with the forces of darkness is that they will always snivel into their lairs and regroup and creep out again later. And they're going to try this in Copenhagen. Not in Copenhagen, we've done that, thank goodness. They're going to try it in Mexico in December of this year. I will be there to stop them.
Just the final point I made, which you and I have discussed before, and I have asked you this question before, but for the benefit of people here, what is the motive therefore? And we're concerned about Australia. What is the motive for, in the weight of incontrovertible evidence that you've talked about, for our own government, our Prime Minister, to prosecute and continue to prosecute untruths? There's talk that this legislation, notwithstanding what you've said, will be reintroduced into our federal parliament next week.
Right. That's a very fair question, and there is the answer. Cuddly polar bears. I think one has to allow always for the possibility that those who express concern about the global warming problem may be doing so because they haven't had the time or perhaps the mental equipment to investigate it in any great depth, and that therefore they genuinely feel, after all the propaganda noises from the environmental activists, that they must save the planet, that we must save the planet, that nobody should be allowed even to question the notion that the planet needs to be saved. Well, call me an old-fashioned Bible-thumping Christian, but the planet was perfectly satisfactorily saved 2,000 years ago, and it doesn't need to be saved again. For some of them, then, I think there is a genuine motive. I think they genuinely think the cuddly polar bears are at risk. Well, they're not. There are 5 times as many of them as there were in 1940. Hardly, as you may think, the profile of a species in imminent threat of extinction. They're doing very well, thank you. In fact, they're growing in numbers in those parts of the Arctic that are warming fastest. And they'd like more warming, please, because the Arctic is still 1 to 2 Celsius cooler than it was in the 1940s. So they would like warmer weather, as would we in Scotland. I mean, I recently had to cancel my order at Haggart's of Aberfeldy for my grass kilt, because it's too darn cold to wear any kind of kilt at the moment. So I think we have to allow, therefore, for a genuine motive. We call it in the classical world the argumentum ad misericordiam. It's the fallacy of pity. You feel sorry for the polar bears, therefore global warming is terrible, therefore we must have an ETS. It doesn't follow. It's not logical, but it is an understandable motivation, a genuine desire to do something useful as a politician, which very few politicians really ever succeed in doing, speaking personally. So there is also, of course, the more obvious and less complimentary motives: fame and fortune, money, power, and glory.
That's it. Yeah.
There's no doubt that if you're a scientist and you want to get a grant for investigating the lesser spotted, ugly-tied talk show host,
there's plenty of people who'd like to do that, I can assure you.
then all you have to do to get your $610,000 grant to investigate the behavior of these strange but lovable creatures than to add, in the context of global warming.
But the chairman of the IPCC has already been successful in gaining the bulk of a $2.5 million UN grant to investigate melting glaciers. He's got a grant from the Carnegie Foundation, his own research body. I mean, he's prosecuted falsities in order to get this money.
I think that is right, I'm afraid. I think there's been far too much downright dishonesty. But I'm going to tell you this. While I am watching, no more dishonesty, no more lies will be tolerated.
Well, we've got some questions. There's a gentleman over here. Yes, sir.
If we get the microphones too.
Have we got a microphone, please? Try to keep your question